Edgar Cayce's Planetary Sojourn in Mercury. Part 2. A soul's sojourn in planet Mercury will give that soul greater mental abilities, and reasoning abilities, or intelligence, that can be applied when returning to planet Earth. The influences from the indwelling in Mercury make for the high mental efficiency and mental abilities. 1. Of a high mental ability through the Mercurian sojourn. From the Mercurian forces the seeking for expressions. The high mental abilities from the Mercurian influence produce the attempt to often analyze. Though there are the influences of the Mercurian forces as of judgment, oft we find that sentiment rules. Judgment means the ability to make considered decisions or come to sensible conclusions. Sentiment means exaggerated and self-indulgent feelings of tenderness, sadness, or nostalgia. From the Mercurian influence we find the high mental abilities, and interests in those subjects that are of the mental as indicated from the philosophical, theoretical, economical, and such conditions in the experiences of individuals, groups or masses. The mental forces as from the Mercurian become as a reasoning influence in the experience of this entity in this sojourn. And while those things that give expression of these are oft held as fanciful, the entity must within itself reason the purposes and the fruit of that to which an idea, an ideal, an act, an association is leading the entity. The tendencies for reading our inclinations from the Mercurian sojourn. The Mercurian, the high mental ability, the seeker. The Mercurian influences make for the high mental abilities, the insight into mental faculties. The student, the inclinations for delving into mental problems, not only in the experience of self but in groups, classes and masses of individuals. In those applications in the Mercurian influence we find the high mental abilities, the desire at times to reason things out alone, the ability to be a good listener, and the ability to ponder things in its own mind. The Mercurian influence has to do with the entity's abilities as a statistician. For as is seen from the astrological aspects of the Mercurian influence, the entity is one of high mental abilities. From the Mercurian sojourn there arises a high mental influence, and a studious nature in the activities of the entity. Studious means doing something deliberately or with a purpose in mind. Also spending a lot of time studying and reading. We find from the astrological aspects, however, high mental abilities, through those influences of the Mercurian activity. We find the high mental abilities, one that reasons oft, yet so oft is governed by those intuitive forces of love and sympathy. In the Mercurian experience the high mental abilities, and with keen judgments in many directions. In the Mercurian aspects we find the high mental forces. For the acumen or the reason that is a portion of the Mercurian experience is carried forward, which is inclined to make for self-sufficiency. From the Mercurian influences we find the high mental efficiency. From the Mercurian influences we find the high mental abilities, tendencies in which the teaching or the abilities to impart to others become as a natural flow. From the Mercurian sojourn do we find the determination, as well as high mental abilities. All of these must be taken into consideration as being the very nature of the entity. The Mercurian sojourn makes for the high mental abilities. And as combined with the Uranian, we find there are periods when the entity may be said to be supersensitive to vibrations, to colors, to harmonies that may even reach the point at times of turning to its experiences or sojourns in the earth. The high mental abilities, the interests in those things of a mechanical nature, those things pertaining to the necessity of figures to denote relative relationships of elements one to another, come from the Mercurian sojourn as well as the sojourn of the entity in the Atlantean experience. Those in the Mercurian, high mental abilities, as combined with the Jupiterian in its benevolent influence, making them more susceptible to creative influences or forces. We find that the entity is deep in its thought, as from the Mercurian experience we find one high in mental abilities. In the Mercurian aspects we find one that makes for the reasoning, and there must be justification for activities in any relationship, or any condition. Wisdom as well, the application of such as justification needs not always be that of development. For the spiritual influence needs no justification, only glorification in thy dealings with thy fellow man. One that is under the Mercurian influence of exceptional mental abilities, in cunning, in wit, in cynicism, and these may be made a portion of, for the development of, or for the building of that which may make for hardships or developments in the entity's present experience. In the Mercurian influence there comes the mental vision, the mental abilities to attune self and many forces that have to do both with those of the cosmic as well as a universal force. From the Mercurian force there is the high mental reasoning. From the Mercurian influence we will find that the entity will be quick at all forms of mental grasping in the spiritual or mental or any form of mental exercise, whether it be in economics or in mathematics or any other form. Hence those injunctions as to consistency in speech and activity of those about the entity in its formative periods. From the astrological aspects we find that the abilities through the mind, or from the Mercurian sojourn, become as the ruling forces. Hence the entity usually admits that it is better in its judgments than most others, and that it may get by with that which others may not, and not make the mistakes that others have. But usually, and eventually, unless there is the tempering of all such associations and activities with creative forces, there is the bringing of the dregs of regret, with material and mental anguish, and the fear of spiritual awakening. The Mercurian influences give the entity a high mental ability, which oft becomes combative with the intuitive or psychic influences, in arriving at judgments. Thus those injunctions that they must be guided from the spiritual influence or ideals. From the Mercurian sojourn we find indicated the mental abilities of the entity, its abilities to make quick, sudden and definite decisions. Not that the entity has not had periods when there have been problems. But when the entity does make changes it is well that thoughts of what might have been be left entirely out of its consciousness. In the Mercurian, that mental ability that makes for an influence in the mental attributes of an individual and its individual development through a given period. In the Mercurian influence, those as make for judgment, counsel, and the mental influences as have to do with the application of the mental body. The Mercurian influence is for a high mental ability, as well as an adaptability to the various influences that affect the mental, this being in the broader sense of mental, in the material mental as well as the higher or super forces in its activity, and that are being used through the principles held or maintained by activities of the entity. High mental abilities arise from the Mercurian influence. The abilities and tendencies are indicated as a writer, as an actor, as pertaining to the screen, which beauty may be expressed in word as well as activity in the experience of the entity in relationships with conditions as well as individuals. Through the influences, then, of the Mercurian influence, we find one of fine mind, one mentally well balanced, as to whether this is used in strategic influences, or playing a game of marbles, or shooting duckpins. The influences also from the Mercurian activities make for the abilities and the mental conditions that have been in the experience of the entity during this sojourn, bringing those about the entity of the exceptional abilities. From the Mercurian, naturally one of high mental executive ability. one that associations with individuals will, or does, have much to do with detail. The entity's reaction to forms of detail is as glancing at same, knowing innately that as is desired to be known, and yet to others often questioning the acts, or the motivative forces in the minds of others. Facts and figures, as well as individuals' motivative actions, then, interest the entity. With the high mental development through the Mercurian influence, the abilities have not only influenced individual activity but have had much to do with influencing the lives and activities of groups and of masses in their relationships to the activity of life in their individual experiences. Mental influence through that of the Mercurian brings into the experience of the entity many gifted in various characters of experience. Many an artist and artiste come to the entity for that of counsel and advice. Many of those in positions that are enviable seek for that of the influence, as may be made in the lives through the association or experience of the entity. We find the high mental ability, as indicated from the Mercurian sojourn, and yet so tense as to oft disregard counsel or advice from others. With that innate and determined desire to be self-sufficient, and to rely upon the own abilities. One in the Mercurian influence of high mental abilities, especially may the entity train or apply self in writing, in the application of self respecting the expression of individual emotion or individual activities in given surroundings or conditions that make for that which influences individual lives in their relationship to thought. The Mercurian influence shows a high-minded individual, one capable of analyzing that which may be data or truth, and to a great extent feel the application of such understanding better than able to give expression to same. The Mercurian influences made for the high mental abilities or mental efficiency. In the Mercurian, the earlier period of the present experience, a very busy, studious, and self-driving one. In the Mercurian forces does the entity find the wisdom of the sage, the seer, as a portion of the experience of self, rather than in the application in that which may be gained from books or from letters, but the words and the sounds and the tones and the colors. For as the vibrations and the healing in the amethyst, that make for the helping and aiding in individuals' assistance or help, the wisdom is balanced in those things that are founded in constructive forces, which it must be, in the healing. From the sojourn in the Mercurian influence there are the mental abilities, those things pertaining to the innate expressions that find manifestations in the desires for details concerning conditions, circumstances, or any influence that makes for an activity in the experience of self. From the Mercurian influences there are the high mental abilities as for discernments in the appreciation of values of the mental and spiritual, rather than material things. The Mercurian influence makes for mental abilities, mental attributes in given directions that are to the entity as a peculiar or exceptional insight into what are the motivative influences in the activities of groups or individuals. High mental abilities from the sojourns in the Mercurian influence. One given to great detail, then, in its associations of things, people, or whatever the activity of the entity may be with those things in materiality, they find themselves in what may be said to be rote or form, or a cause, a purpose for the activities of the inner self. The entity coming from the Mercurian influences, or the high mental abilities, there are the innate urges of analyzing, or delving into the causes and the effects of that within each influence which the entity may contact. As to what makes or causes or produces such reactions in the affairs of individuals or groups or nations. Under the influence, then, in the Mercurian force or experience, there is seen that of exceptional mental abilities, with the love for the delving into those of mysteries of every nature, especially as pertaining to thought, mind, or those emanations from same. From the Mercurian influence we find the high mental ability of the entity, and the innate desire to deal with things that have to do with people, rather than with people themselves. Hence, in a mathematical turn, does the entity reason, for itself, in the material as well as spiritual, that if this or that is to be relied upon, then the other must be the answer to the question. The Mercurian influence makes for the high mental vision without body, without form, without running to influences that are standardized but giving expression rather in the bigness of the littleness of the thing for its spirituality and activity and same. We find the Mercurian influence makes for a high mental ability that tends towards the analytical mind. In Mercury we find the high mental abilities of the body, quick at resentment, and as quick to forgive. In the astrological aspects, through Mercury comes those influences for the mental, and of the ethereal mindedness of the entity. From Mercury we find the high mental sense of honor, yet recreant in accusing or blaming others with faults. Far from fault-finding then is the natural innate manifestation of the entity's innate self. The high mental abilities, the interests in those things of a mechanical nature, those things pertaining to the necessity of figures to denote relative relationships of elements one to another, come from the Mercurian sojourn as well as the sojourn of the entity in the Atlantean experience. In Mercury we find the great mental abilities, while in Saturn the moody experiences. In those in Mercury, we find these as innate and manifested in an intuitive manner. Those of the keen mental abilities, with the seeking of relationships and reasoning of things. In the influences as seen in that of Mercury, has brought for the entity most of the music, and especially the symphony, or the chords of the spheres. In Mercury we find much of the mental abilities, the mental stability of the entity. In Mercury, high mental abilities is the entity, with the liking for or desire for study, the liking or desire for knowledge. But such knowledge as statistics, such knowledge as of the natures where the influences or activities of individuals or groups are to be maintained, is not to be used wholly for self and self-aggrandizement, or self-advantage taken over others. To be sure, it may be used in such measures as to bring greater material opportunities, greater material successes, but at the behest, and not at the advantage taken over less fortunate ones or those who have not applied themselves. In Mercury, those influences in the entity of that as is of the mental intuitive forces, and the entity itself may gain much through the dependence of self's own mental forces, aided by that training in the application of the ideal forces, to be able to meet the situations in life as they present themselves from time to time. In Mercury, as well as in Uranus, we find the high mental abilities, the capacities of judgments. In the astrological we find the entity coming under a very strong-willed purpose in Mercury. Hence the entity is subtle, oft in its manner, yet of high mental capacities. In Mercury comes those influences in the mental plane, and the application of knowledge that may be applied from material standpoints, as well as from the economic influence of a spiritual life in same. In Mercury we find one of mental abilities that make for that, with the Jupiterian forces, of a high-minded and ennobling influence. The influences in Mercury make for those mental capacities, the abilities for making the influences felt in relationships to others, as well as to things. We find Mercury indicated in the high mental forces. In those influences from Mercury we find a high mental ability. In the astrological aspects we find that Mercury rules. Hence we find judgments, the abilities to analyze. Do not become too analytical for its own self, but for a purpose, yes. In Mercury, the high mental abilities, the practicality also of spiritual as well as mystical, as well as material things in the innate forces of the body. Or the question ever, For what purpose is this? In Mercury, we find the high mental abilities as a ruling influence by that as oft reaches almost intuition, as is commonly known. And thus the entity has what some call hunches, intuitive forces.